Welcome to this program in the Our Finger Lakes History Series. I am Seneca County historian Walter Gable. This program will deal with the impact that the terrible influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1919 had upon the residents of the Finger Lakes. However, before I deal with specifics about the impact upon Finger Lakes residents, I want to make sure that the viewing audience has a basic understanding of some important facts about this influenza pandemic of 1918 and 1919. You will note in these facts that the influenza epidemic killed over 21 million people worldwide. You will also note that more Americans died in this influenza pandemic than have died in all of our fighting wars in United States history. Now, what does this word pandemic mean? A pandemic is so large an epidemic of infectious disease that it spreads across continents, if not worldwide. The influenza epidemics or pandemic of 1918 and 1919 actually came in at least 3 waves shown in that graph, 2 of which were in 1918 and a third wave in 1919. The influenza pandemic of 1918 and 1919 was not your typical flu that we have experienced in our lifetimes in recent years. The flu pandemic of 1918 and 19 was most deadly for people between the ages of 20 and 40, rather than the very young and the very old. Other ways in which that pandemic was not your typical flu was that it spread at an unusually rapid rate, that it killed a proportionately higher rate of those who were infected, and that it spread in seasons other than just winter. I also want to emphasize that this flu pandemic is directly linked to wartime conditions of World War I. American soldiers crowded together on ships crossing the Atlantic Ocean enabled the infection to spread quickly among other soldiers. Soldiers returning home could bring the germs with them back to the United States. People here in the United States gathered in mass celebrations of soldiers going off to war or returning home victorious, enabled the easier spread of the infectious germs. So how did this flu strain cause so many deaths among people ages 20 to 40, an age group that we think of as being in the healthy part of their life? The single basic answer to that question is that the flu virus caused a cytokine storm, an overreaction of the body's immune system. So the healthy people between ages 20 to 40 had a stronger immune system and thus had a more intense reaction to this flu virus. Pneumonia and influenza went hand in hand and were often mixed together in the statistics cited, even on death certificates. The influenza hit first, and if it didn't kill you in a day or two, then very possibly bacterial pneumonia would develop to kill you weeks later. Victims bled out of ruptured lungs, drowned in their own fluids, turning bluish from a lack of oxygen. Even bleeding from the ears took place, with hemorrhages from mucous membranes such as the nose, the stomach, the intestine, and even the skin. So why was this flu epidemic incorrectly called the Spanish flu when it didn't originate in Spain? The explanation is that Spain was a neutral country during World War I, And as a neutral country, the Spanish government didn't censor its press like the nations of both sides at war did. So Spanish newspapers were filled with reports and warnings of the disease in Spain. On May 22, 1918, a Madrid newspaper first reported that it was a French flu because it was breaking out in France. That's same date, the Spanish king Alphonse XIII, who is shown in the lower right here, and several of the members of his cabinet became infected. So Spanish newspapers were filled with flu stories for days, and the press of other countries carried these stories, and hence the origin of the term, the Spanish flu. Another main question is, why was it so difficult to find this Spanish flu here in the United States? There was no coordination within the United States as a whole. Doctors and scientists at the time of the outbreak were unsure as to what caused it and how to treat it. There were no effective vaccines or antiviral drugs at the time. The demands of World War I militarily had left parts of the United States with a shortage of physicians and other health workers to deal with the flu outbreak here at home. Many of the health workers and doctors who were available here at home came down with the flu themselves. Hospitals in some areas were so overwhelmed with patients that other facilities, such as schools, public buildings, had to become makeshift hospitals. So with that background, let's turn our attention to the specific influenza impact here in the Finger Lakes area. The situation in Waterloo was detailed in John Becker's 1949 History of Waterloo. By October 1st, 1918, he reported there were over 50 cases of the flu in Waterloo. Note the ages of those who died in Waterloo at that time. You will see they're 21 to 30. Becker concluded his writing about this epidemic by saying, quote, "It was a sad time in Waterloo. No one knew what the flu was or how to treat it, and all feared contracting it. There was no indication where it might stop. It seemed to take the very strongest of the young people." The situation in Seneca Falls can be identified by articles in the Reveille newspaper. I am quoting from the Reveille issue of October 25th, 1918, but I have highlighted in red some portions that I want to draw your attention to specifically. Note that the article is for October 25th. For Waterloo, I had reported October 1st, so by October 25th, the flu epidemic was pretty much easing up in Seneca Falls. Nevertheless, you can see that this Reveille newspaper article said, quote, "The entire community is shadowed in gloom over the loss of so many excellent citizens." And you can note that churches and schools would still be closed for another week. The Reveille issue of December 6, 1918, reported that the Trinity Episcopal Church's new parish house had been used as a basis of operations for the local churches, quote, "who took turns each day for about 2.5 weeks to provide soups, custards, and other supplies daily to an average of 40 families. The article goes on to say, Seneca Falls may be proud of its record. In no instance has it shown a higher spirit of devotion than in meeting the tremendous problems imposed upon it by the epidemic, now happily almost ended. Beyond all question, that spirit of devotion was exemplified most by those who risked their lives to care for others." This is an article from the November 7th, 1918 issue of the Seneca County Courier Journal. I have highlighted and read the statement that there were 52 deaths in Seneca Falls in October caused by pneumonia, which probably means the flu. In its November 28th issue, the Seneca County Courier Journal reported that public schools in Seneca Falls were closed for Thanksgiving Day, but reopened the next day, a Friday, apparently to make up for the large number of days in October and earlier in November that the schools were closed because of the flu epidemic. Imagine trying to have public schools open now on the day after Thanksgiving. The bottom newspaper article points out that in Holly, west of Rochester, the public schools' school day was lengthened 1 hour a day to make up for the instructional time lost because of the flu epidemic. This December 5th newspaper article from the Seneca County Courier Journal, reported that there were much fewer flu cases during the month of November. This helps to show the basic fact that the flu epidemic struck a community for just a short period of time and then probably moved on to another community. I have concluded this article from December 26th of the Seneca County Courier Journal to help reinforce the fact that while communities in the Finger Lakes were suffering through the flu epidemic, it was striking our soldiers in Europe fighting in the First World War. Here we have the account of a Seneca Falls soldier who was stricken with the flu while in France. Rather than quoting the article, I can point out the soldier basically reported on his harrowing transports until he got good service at a base hospital. And he goes on to say that soon he would be well enough to get back to near the front lines of the incoming fighting. In January 2009, I wrote an article on this great influenza pandemic for the Reveille Between the Lakes newspaper. When Dorothy VanFleet Hicks read my article, she sent me a letter providing information about how the flu epidemic impacted her relatives. Her mother, Ruth Engel VanFleet of Willard, in late September 1918, was in Albany Business School, and she was to meet her beau, Ben Franklin, at the train station. He was to be en route home on leave from the Navy. He never showed at the train station because he died the day before of the flu. Dorothy also reported that her father's sister Eva, age 24, had just left home for her first teaching job. She died of the flu the last week of September 1918. Turning to Geneva, we have here statistics on the number of flu deaths in Geneva for November and December and January 1918. You will note that the number of flu deaths in Geneva are relatively low compared to that 52 deaths that I reported in 1 month for Seneca Falls. Here I am beginning to report on how the flu epidemic affected Hobart and William Smith colleges in Geneva. The college newspaper, the Hobart Herald, reported that Tim McCarthy, a 1918 graduate of Hobart, was in France and was as a soldier and was stricken with the flu. Here you see that the college newspaper reported that Deke Welts, who had been a college coach, was a soldier in World War I, and he was stricken with the flu. How did it impact sports schedules in the area schools? The Rushville Chronicle and Gorham News Age newspaper article relates how the winter high school basketball season had to be altered because of the days the schools were closed due to the flu epidemic. Turning to Schuyler County, we have articles from the Montour Falls Free Press that pointed out that all schools, churches, and places of public gathering were closed for an indefinite period of time as that flu epidemic was spreading through their communities. More specifically, the Montour Falls Public Library set up special procedures for patrons to return books during the flu epidemic. They were to be wrapped in paper with a slip attached stating that. But the library did not waive fines for late return of borrowed books. In Yates County, a Penn Yan newspaper reported, quote, "There was no indication of concern in the local papers until the first week of October. On October 11th, 30 influenza cases were reported by doctors in Penn Yan, and there were 10 to 12 new cases being reported each day." The articles reported that Yates County had a serious shortage of doctors. For example, using Penn Yan, 4 of Penn Yan's doctors were off in Europe with the U.S. Army in World War I, leaving few doctors at home to help deal with the sick here in the Penn Yan area. Yates County Health Commissioner Dr. Joseph T. Cox ordered an end to all public assemblies until further notice. Schools were canceled, theaters were closed, churches suspended worship service. Public funerals were not allowed for victims dying of the flu. Organizations around the county canceled their meetings. Before that order was lifted on November 17th, Dr. Cox himself contracted the influenza and died at the age of 52. For more about Yates County, between mid-October and early December 1918, newspaper community columns from all over Yates County included the names of college students that came home because their colleges closed because of the flu, probably or possibly bringing the flu germs home with them. By late October, 250 cases were reported in the village of Penn Yan. A Rushville comment, quote, "No one appears on the street unless it is absolutely necessary. There is no school or church or gatherings of any kind, and the days pass slowly, with nothing to distinguish one day from another, with flu the chief topic of conversation, and the helping to care for the sick the only alternative left for the well ones." Rushville had 2 doctors, and one of them reported making 57 house calls in one day. On a more positive note, however, Penn Yan got a new hospital as a result of this flu epidemic. For several years, there had been talk of building a hospital in Penn Yan, but the influenza epidemic caused those talks to become serious. In January 1919, after the last mention of influenza in the local newspapers, meetings began that resulted in the opening of the Soldiers and Sailors Hospital in 1924. As for Steuben County, schools were closed in Bath, Ithaca, Corning, Hammondsport, Savona, and parts of Wheeler. Churches canceled services in Ithaca, Corning, Prattsburg, and South Bradford. In Mount Morris, horse-drawn scrapers were digging graves for the multiple burials due to the flu deaths. Dansville and Bath were particularly hard hit. In Corning, about 3,500 became ill and about 70 died. Emergency hospitals were set up in Corning and Painted Post. Still more news bits for Steuben County. Hammondsport school children were ordered to stay on their own premises until under pain of arrest. Quarantine families were kept alive by leaving food on the doorsteps of the houses where they were sick. Churches and lodges were asked to close, but a suggestion to close saloons and pool rooms met no response. One newspaper grumpily observed that the government's call to conserve coal conflicted with the government's advice to keep warm and avoid the flu. Now, for some other statistics outside of the Finger Lakes. Rochester's death rate from influenza and pneumonia in 1918 was 4 times that of 1915 or 16. Buffalo's was even higher. Statewide, New York's death toll from the flu or pneumonia was more than triple the normal number of deaths. Next, the situation in Ithaca. October 1918, the Ithaca Journal reported that public areas in Ithaca would remain open, even though public areas such as streetcars, schools, and saloons were closed in Buffalo and Rochester. On Monday, October 14th, the Ithaca Journal reported there were 600 cases of the flu citywide. 7 had died over the weekend. The city hospital and the Cornell University Infirmary were at full capacity. The Sage College annex of Cornell turned into an overflow hospital. Masons opened their meeting halls to be sickbed sites. Appeals for helpers were made as many city nurses were also sick. A similar situation existed in Syracuse, but the flu was serious in Syracuse earlier than some other parts of the Greater Finger Lakes. Approximately September 21, 1918, the Krause-Irving Hospital crammed 300 influenza cases into a ward designed to handle only 200 patients. Specialized wards in the hospital were converted into influenza treatment areas. The shortage of hospital nurses caused the Red Cross to issue a request for all graduate nurses in the area to assist in the fight against influenza. On October 4th came a request from the mayor, the city health officer, and the commissioner of public safety that city doctors report all cases of influenza to the health department. It was only a request, however, because a city health officer admitted influenza is not a reportable disease, and it is too late now to issue a regulation requiring that it be reported. Syracuse had a World War I soldiers recruit camp at the New York State Fairgrounds. By September 21, 1918, the influenza had struck this recruit camp. On September 28, the camp commander ordered the camp under quarantine, with civilians barred from entering the camp. The camp commandant detailed camp orderlies to work at the city hospitals, where they were assigned duties in the kitchens, laundry facilities, and to some extent on the hospital wards. Now to turn to Auburn. On October 9, 1918, the Auburn Citizen estimated there were 1,000 people already sick with the flu in the city of Auburn. The Public Health Department ordered all public places of assembly, including churches, schools, movie theaters, and the Seymour Library, closed until further notice. Public burials of people who had died of the flu were also forbidden. I have used this visual to depict the situation in Auburn, to underscore the fact that this flu epidemic was hitting Auburn while the United States was involved in World War I. So I trust that by this point you have learned that the influenza pandemic of 1918 and 1919 had its impact locally throughout the Finger Lakes. It is therefore easy to see how this flu epidemic became characterized as a danger greater than war. But remember that while it was occurring here in the Finger Lakes in 1918 and 1919, we have thousands of U.S. soldiers over in Europe fighting in World War I, and that soldiers there, in many cases, were suffering this flu epidemic. This is a common popular poem or ditty at the time of this great flu epidemic. I had a little bird, and its name was Enza. I opened the window, and influenza. Another one, Mary had a little lamb. She also had the flu. And when she left the nursery, the others had it too. So anytime your child is sick, please keep him home with you. Then the children in our nursery will be happy and healthier too. I didn't want to close on such a tragic note as most of the program has been. So here I show a recent cartoon that suggests that yet today we don't take the threat of a new pandemic seriously enough. One of the last things I want to cover is some information about our most recent flu seasons. The 2018 to 19 influenza season was the longest flu season in the United States in a whole decade. Over 57,000 deaths occurred in the United States in this influenza season of 2018-2019. That 57,000 deaths plus is a figure greater than the soldier casualties in the Vietnam War, but it is still a small figure compared to the civilian deaths in the United States in the influenza epidemic or pandemic of 1918 to 1919. I hope you have enjoyed this program, which is part of our Finger Lakes History Series.